it's my pleasure to introduce to you Thomas Saenz. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, and thank all of you for being here this morning. Good morning. I want to talk about a very important case decided by the United States Supreme Court in June of this year. I will note that what they did in these cases, called SFFA versus Harvard University and SFFA versus the University of North Carolina, was to overturn a 45-year-old case decided in 1978. And I mention that because this is the second time that this Supreme Court majority has overturned a long-standing court precedent. You may recall that last June of 2022, the Supreme Court overturned the 49-year-old case of Roe versus Wade, a case that for 49 years protected the right of women to reproductive choice. They followed that up this year with a second case overturning a precedent of over 4 decades in the Harvard and UNC cases. These cases involved whether Harvard and the University of North Carolina could continue to consider the race of applicants in a limited fashion in order to ensure that they were able to enroll a student body that is diverse and more reflective of the population that the two universities serve. This affirmative action, as it's become to be known, had been permitted for 45 years since the first case challenging affirmative action went to the Supreme Court in 1978. That case in 1978 came from our own state of California. It was a case called Bakke versus the University of California Regents. And in that case, a white applicant to the UC Davis Medical School challenged a program that had been established at UC Davis Medical School to ensure that the university could contribute to increasing the ranks of Black and Latino doctors in the state of California. At that time in 1978, and of course, continuing today, there is an extreme underrepresentation of Latinos and Blacks in leading professions like the medical profession. So UC Davis had established a program that set aside 16 seats out of 100 in its medical school specifically for Black and Latino medical school applicants. And a white applicant, Bakke, challenged that as against the Constitution and against Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the major achievements of the civil rights movement in legislation signed by then President Lyndon Johnson. In 1978, the Supreme Court split. 4 justices had one opinion, 4 justices had an opposing opinion, and 1 justice was right in the middle. When you have a split like that in our Supreme Court, the justice who's in the middle basically gets to decide what the law will be. And in 1978, a justice named Lewis Powell decided that the UC Davis Medical School program that set aside 16 seats was unlawful and could not continue. Specifically, he described that program as a quota, and that quotas are not permitted. But he also concluded that UC Davis Medical School, and by extension all selective universities across the country, could lawfully consider race as one of many factors. They could consider it in a narrow and limited way in order to contribute to diversity within the university. Now, it's important to note that the only reason he said could be used to justify consideration of race was diversity, ensuring that different viewpoints, different backgrounds, different perspectives were represented in the classroom. More important, he rejected way back in 1978 any notion that you could consider race in order to address the effects of what he called generalized societal discrimination. So he decided way back in 1978 that universities can't consider race if it's about addressing and remedying discrimination. But nonetheless, in 1978, the Supreme Court left open the consideration of race in a limited fashion in making admissions decisions in order to contribute to diversity. What this Supreme Court, our current Supreme Court, did in June, by a vote of 6 justices to 3, was to take away the ability to use diversity as a justification for considering race in making admissions decisions. What that means in practice is there is now no permissible justification for considering race as a part of an admissions system. So because of that Harvard and UNC decision, all of our universities across the country, both public universities and all private universities, may no longer engage in race-conscious affirmative action, which means they may no longer consider as a part of their admission system the race of applicants. But I want to add that this does not mean, and the Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote this opinion, made clear that this does not mean that an applicant, in filling out their application for a university, cannot talk about their race and how their race and racial discrimination may have affected their life and their application. So I want to reiterate that. Chief Justice Roberts said that any student can still write in an application essay about race and racial discrimination, and the university may consider that essay and the experience of race and racial discrimination in evaluating that individual student's application for admission. I reiterate that because there are folks in our country who have already tried to misinterpret what the court said in June to restrict even more what is allowed in universities. Now, some of you know that here in California, our public universities, mainly the University of California, but increasingly, even our California State University campuses, have been barred from considering race in making admissions decisions since our electorate enacted Proposition 209 way back in 1996. So in our state, for 27 years, our public universities have already been prohibited from using race in making admissions decisions. As you'll hear from my good friend Audrey Dow, that experience of 27 years means that here in California, we have already made some initial changes to get to a more fair and equitable admissions system at the University of California. But I want you all to know that Proposition 209 did not affect private universities in California. But the decision by the Supreme Court in June does affect private universities, including those in California. So now places like Stanford University or USC in downtown Los Angeles can no longer use race as an element of their admissions system. That is to say, this decision by the Supreme Court will have effects even here in California, where for 27 years our public universities have already been prohibited from considering race. I want to emphasize how extraordinary and potentially dangerous the decision by the Supreme Court in June this year is. Again, this is overturning 45 years, almost half a century, of what previous justices have repeatedly said is permitted. It is also a potential serious blow to our efforts at educational equality and educational equity. But there is much that we, the community, can do to address this decision. There is nothing that says we must continue to use the admissions system and criteria that have been used for half a century. Specifically, we need to demand collectively that our universities, particularly public universities for which all of our taxes pay, but private universities as well, we must demand that they look at their admissions system, every detail of it, and eliminate the elements that have discriminatory effects on Latinos or Blacks or any other racial group for that matter. The fact is, we know from well-documented research that many of the criteria used to make admissions decisions have deep, deep discriminatory effects on Latinos and Blacks. And we must demand that they change those criteria. I'll give just one example, and you may have seen it discussed already in the media. And that is, many universities provide what is called legacy preferences. Okay? A legacy preference is giving help, additional consideration, an extra point, if you will, or more, to those who are legacies, quote unquote, of the university. Legacies are students applying for admission whose parents, one or both of them, attended that university. So at Stanford, if your parents, one of them, went to Stanford, you get extra points in the admissions process at Stanford University. This is true at many private universities and many public universities across the country. But because of our history in this country of exclusion of so many populations, including Latinos and Blacks, from ever being allowed to attend these schools until 50 or so years ago. And even after they started admitting brown and Black students, they admitted very few in comparison to population. And so that means that very few of these legacies who are getting extra points today in admissions decisions are brown or Black. That's obviously discriminatory. It may not be described as we're going to discriminate against certain racial groups, but the effect of it is to discriminate in favor of white applicants whose parents had the opportunity to attend the university that their son or daughter now wishes to attend. But legacy preferences are only one element of our current admission systems that show demonstrable, significant, discriminatory effects in harming the chances of Latino and Black students of being admitted. I know Audrey's going to talk more about that. But that's just one step that we as a community can collectively demand of our universities. I'll add one more, and then I'll conclude. And that is, we need to demand that all of our universities, public and private, recruit students from our communities everywhere that we live. We know that most selective universities only recruit from certain high schools and certain neighborhoods, with the result that lots of our students don't even know about the opportunity to apply to be admitted to a school like Stanford or a school like Yale, where I had the opportunity to attend. Because these schools target their recruitment at high schools in certain areas, and that skews against Latino populations in particular. Because as you all know, Latinos are now the largest minority group in the entire United States. At 19% of the nation's population, Latinos have been the largest minority group for over 20 years. We live in every state, in every region of the country. And when they only recruit selectively, they are leaving out many, many, many Latino communities in California and across the country. So we can and should collectively demand that all universities be more complete, comprehensive in how they recruit students to apply for admission to their universities. I want to end by emphasizing what the Supreme Court did in June is an injustice. It is an injustice that is a result of our Supreme Court having been packed wrongly by Donald Trump and his administration. 3 of the 6 justices who voted to overrule affirmative action were Trump appointees. Donald Trump should not have had the opportunity to appoint more than 1 justice. But frankly, through cheating, he was able to appoint 3. That made the difference in this case. That injustice creates obstacles to our efforts, which we have been engaged in as a community for over 50 years, our efforts to try to achieve education equity, an equal and fair opportunity for Latino students to be admitted and to complete their education at whatever higher education institution they choose, to have the same rights as wealthy white students to attend any university they wish to attend. But we have strength in our community. It's shown in our history, in our resilience, in what so many of you go through on a daily, weekly basis. Our strength comes through, and we can marshal that strength as a group to pressure our universities, despite that unjust decision, to move us closer to admission systems that are fair and equitable for all. Thanks.
Thank you, Tomas.